Welcome back to 2077. Let's talk about the thing I do like. City assets. Yeah, these are wonderful. This is $60 million worth of city assets. Now, I don't really like... Oh, hold on. I'm being told the game cost $300 million. This is $60 million of game assets, and they're beautiful. They do their job spectacularly. I don't particularly like how the city is put together, arranged. I don't like how it's lit. But the assets themselves are wonderful. They do an amazing job, and I know that a lot of people agree with me. There are people who play this game because they like being in this city. And maybe if we were in a world where we were allowed to be in cities in reality still, this wouldn't have so much of a punch. But we are where we are, and it's really nice to be able to walk around in a city and feel like you're in a city, and drive around and feel like you're driving around in a city. It's something we don't get very much anymore. So I can understand why people liked this city. And it's an expensive city. But it's not quite as expensive as you might think. Or maybe it is, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to show you some of the tricks they use to keep their costs down. And hopefully you'll have a little bit of an understanding of how this sort of city can get put together. So the first trick you're going to need is repetition. This is not even really a trick. In order to keep costs down, you have to repeat. And I don't just mean like money costs. You have to repeat because your computers simply can't handle all bespoke assets. If every building is unique, you're going to set your computer on fire. So what you do is you have assets that just repeat over and over and over and over and over, but you engineer them so that the player won't notice that they are repeating over and over and over and over and over. These assets are specifically engineered to have the player's eyes kind of glaze across them and not really notice what they're looking at. No, down. Thank you. See? This asset is used literally thousands of times in this district. It's part of the district's design language. And because of that repetition, that lowers the load on the GPU, and it also lowers the load on your designers who don't have to make bespoke air vents for every single building. Now, whether or not these buildings were put together in Unreal out of pieces or whatever, or whether they were put together, whole units in and just exported as standalone buildings, I couldn't say. But the tricks are the same either way. And it's not limited to just little components like those. You see that little hoop? There it is. There it is. Skip a floor. There it is. There it is. There it is. Skip a floor. There it is. There it is. There it is. This is literally the same set of floors repeated over and over and over and over and over. In fact, what they've done is they've created a bundle of 3 and then repeated it 3 times. And you can see that by looking out on the right here. You can see how the exterior elements repeat like that. So I, again, don't know whether or not those are arranged in Houdini and exported as a single building, or whether we're looking at 3 repeated prefabs or maybe 12 repeated prefabs. I couldn't tell you. It doesn't really matter to me. All I can tell you for sure is that these buildings are super repeating. Now, normally I would recommend things like, oh, well, use a shader that's got some world space magic in it so that you don't get the same noise values repeating over and over and over. But the real trick here is that if it's above the player's head, the player won't notice. Anything above the player's head is just for ambiance. And that's something that these devs clearly understood, because they were very clear about making the buildings above the player's head use repetitive rules. For example, you see this trio here? This little set? Well, there it is again. How many times do you think they're going to use it? How about there and there? We can round the corner. There and there. There are other places in this area that use it as well. This is a situation where you repeat the same sets of floors, and this particular set of devs loved to repeat sets of 3. For some reason, they were really stuck on sets of 3. And I'm showing you ones that are really obvious, these clusters here, because I wanted to make it clear that if it's above the player's eye, it can be really obvious. You do not have to be subtle about it. There are a lot of more subtle versions of this, if I can remember which way I'm facing. There's a capsule hotel on one of these corners that does the same thing, but really aggressively. Oh, there it is. See this capsule hotel. This capsule hotel has the same set of modules like literally 100 times, and they're barely modified at all. How unmodified are they? Ding. 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 They all have the exact same noise damage. Because they knew nobody would notice, not unless you were some kind of asshole with a chip on your shoulder. So there is no problem making buildings above eye level repeat, but there are a few more tricks that they use that are particularly nice. One of those tricks is the use of repeated design, so what do I want to call it? Props. Repeated iconic props. Because if you see the same prop across several different kinds of building, you will start to not notice that the actual buildings that you're seeing them on are repeating. Now, what do I mean? Well, if you take a look at these towels, there's only one towel in this entire city, rather this district. Every single one of these towels is identical. Nobody has a blue towel or a patterned towel or anything. But because these towels are everywhere, players will start to notice that the towel is what ties all of these buildings together. And if they happen to see, the building is repeating, that's okay, because really what they're noticing is that there are more towels. So by using an iconic prop across multiple buildings, when you repeat a building, it lowers the impact. It lowers the amount of repetition the players will really see. This is also in part because the buildings are so boring to look at. If you had really super iconic buildings, then this wouldn't work. Like if you were repeating some kind of really, for example, that statue over there, you couldn't repeat him just because he's above the player's eyes. But you can repeat these capsules, even though they're fairly iconic, because they are intended to repeat, the player's eyes will kind of glaze across them. How iconic or how repetitive is that? These are actually the same noise pattern. So presumably they just re-shelled it a little bit. But how about at ground level? I wanted to talk about one more repeating element. You see, you're going to have repeating elements of all types, and you don't have to always leave them at the same sort of scale. For example, this here, this vertical strut uses the same design language as the vents we were talking about earlier. Because that design language is repeated, we stop noticing the vents so much because there are other things that use the same design language, which allows us a little bit of slack on the repeating vent because there are other things that aren't repeating. Moreover, this vertical strut can be seen in many places. For example, that same strut is over here. But it's been scaled a little bit. Thank you. But it's been scaled a little bit. See? Same strut, but it's been squashed. And over there, you can see the Magic Giant Towel, which is actually the exact same towel, but stretched. So because of these things, you can really work out the sort of flexibility you've got with the same assets. You do not need to have a million bespoke assets. You need to have some foundational aspects, some foundational elements that you can repeat forever. And you need to get the ground level right. The thing the player is always going to notice is going to be the ground level. If it's above the player's head, they probably won't notice. If they're looking down on it, they might notice. If it's in their face, they're definitely going to notice. And that's why this particular setting is really careful to try and break up the ground level noise. And I think that that's a really good idea. Over here, for example, you can see that we've got some very repetitive elevator elements, but one of them is open and one of them is closed, so that you don't feel like you're facing a wall of exactly the same elevator elements. And I actually thought this was a different alley, and I was going to give a different example, but it's the same basic setup everywhere you go, right? The big thing they do is they try to break up all of their materials. They try and change out materials. So you'll often find repeated meshes, but because they have different materials, you won't notice the repetition. And I'm afraid that I've gotten myself lost, so I can't really show you as much as I wanted to. Now this one's a classic, right? This one shows up everywhere, but they change out what the sign says, they change out the color, they change out the exact texture. I wish I hadn't gotten lost, though, because I had a really good example. Here, this will do. Oh, this is it. Good. I found it. Hooray, I'm not lost anymore. So these four are the exact same asset. They are literally exactly the same asset. You can see down to even the curves on the edges of the assets here. You see how this curve kind of glunks and stops, and then this curve is carefully hidden inside of something else. They're trying to show you that this is not the same asset over and over and over, even though it is. And the way they do that is they change out the material, and they occasionally add in a blocker. This is a blocker. Do not block door. Ha, funny. This is a blocker. It cuts into the existing mesh in a way that the player breaks up the repetition, so the player doesn't feel like the mesh is repeating. But the materials on these are different. See? It's the same setup. Here's another set of blockers. Same setup, but different materials, so that you won't notice that it's the same over and over and over again. They also use different signs, and in some cases they'll occasionally tweak one of the elements a little bit. So by having differing elements, specifically differing materials and differing lighting, you can keep the player from noticing the fact that the street level is full of the exact same repeating asset. Or you can have assets that the player won't notice. Can you see an asset that you're not noticing? Well, maybe not. Here it is. Yeah, if you make an asset boring enough, the player won't notice it. You have to be a little bit careful about that, because if there's nothing else for the player to notice, they will notice your repeating asset. But in this case, the devs don't want the player to go, oh, look over here. They'd like to draw the player's attention down there into the alleyway with all the color. So they make this side bland and repetitive, and they light this side. Now, clearly what this means is that there's lots of stuff over here that the player should really be doing. And look, it's true. It's true. There is, in fact, something to do under a light. Oh my God. If you haven't seen all my videos, I might not be sure why I'm cry laughing. That never happens. Congrats, devs. Congrats. I'm so happy. Now, previously I've also talked about the idea of adding clutter, things like trash in the corners. Trash in the corners as a classic approach. You do need to add that sort of thing. You do need to break it up, but it's just not as powerful as understanding how to lay the city out in a way that is more focused on the form. That's not really part of this video, though. It's just something that I wanted to point out. Repeating trash bags that will kill you. Yep, these trash bags will kill you. Because they're physics, and the physics in this game is bupkis. Now, there are plenty of other things I want to talk about. This game is full of awesome, awesome city assets. I could make a 50-episode tour of the city, no problem. I can talk a lot. But, it's worth pointing out that all of these assets are assets you're not supposed to notice. And I talked about this when I was talking about Nier Automata. My Nier Automata modular video says the same things. They create these fences so that you won't notice them repeating. They create the guardrails so that you won't notice them repeating. They create the windows so that you won't notice them repeating. And they don't worry too much about times when it doesn't quite fit together. In fact, I don't know if you noticed, but as we were walking around the area looking at those green things, a number of those green things literally do things like cut fans in half. They don't make any sense. But nobody cares because they are designed not to get noticed, so you don't notice them. Let's see if I can find that exact fan cutty and halfy bit. I think it's over here. Oh, look. Stuff that you're not supposed to notice. Oh, I was really hoping this said no regrets. The use of stencils is really powerful. It was something we couldn't really do very easily until recently. So if you have a chance to use stencils, that can really help to break up the repetitiveness of any sort of such situation, because you can just put graffiti on. See? Do you want to bet that I'm the only person in the history of the universe to ever notice that this fan got cut in half? Probably. It's incredibly unimportant. Nobody cares, not even me. So you can get away with a lot as long as your assets are built with an understanding of how to draw the player's eye. You want the player's eye to glaze across most of your city, because most of your city is there to add ambiance, not to be noticed. Yep. Hooray! That's it. Have a good one, everybody.